Hi guys, today we're going to resolve this official GMAT question. It's a sentence correction question, but before we do that, I want to talk you through it a little bit. So what we need to know about are comparative adjectives. Now we don't need to know an awful lot about them to get this right, but we have to have an idea of how they work. So we're just going to switch over here and we're going to talk about it a little bit. So it's best maybe to start off with one you're all very familiar with. So we could say something like, you've probably heard, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. Now, we've heard this probably many times in the past. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. Usually you'll have a comma here in between. And so it's this kind of structure of the something. And what you have to realize is that there's a relationship between these two things. They're correlated. So as something gets bigger and bigger and bigger, the harder it will fall. And so when we have this kind of cause and effect, this relationship of two things that are correlated like this, we like to put it with comparative adjectives. And so the bigger, the harder. We could have the more, the greater, whatever, the longer the exam, the harder it is, so on and so forth. So this cause and effect relationship, when the two things are correlated, we need to have these comparative adjectives. So comparative adjectives are words like longer, harder, more, greater, bigger, harder. So usually they're with ERs, but you will get more come up quite often as well. So now that you're familiar with this structure, why don't you try resolve this question? So pause the video now, try it out for yourself, and then we'll discuss it together afterwards. Okay, welcome back. So, Dr. Hakuta's research among Hispanic children in the United States indicates that the more the children use both Spanish and English, their intellectual advantage is greater in skills underlying reading ability and non-verbal logic. So, here we have the more. And it's clear we're indicating this relationship. So, the more they use these things, well, then what comes after the comma should have this cause and effect that we spoke about. So it should be the more something, the greater something. So we get that in C. Now, could be a little bit straightforward, but there's other things we need to think about here. So, for example, I've worked through this question with students before, and they've said to me, but what about sentence structure? There's no verb in the second part of this after the comma in the second part of this sentence. What is this? Why don't we have a verb here? Well, students sometimes get obsessed about sentence structure, and they're right, but the thing here is that when we have two things that are clearly parallel, and these constructions don't get any more parallel, the more the greater to comparative adjectives, it's very clear what we're talking about, we can drop the verb. And so if you like, it's implied that the verb is here. But this is perfectly parallel. With this construction, we can get away with dropping the verb. And so C is going to be our answer. A is wrong because it doesn't respect the idiom. Their intellectual advantage is greater. So that's wrong. Their intellectual advantage is greater. Again, it's wrong. And then we get, instead of having the pronoun there, we get the preposition in skills underlying reading ability and verbal logic. Their intellectual advantage is the greater, so that's wrong. We would say is greater as well, so that's another reason why D is wrong. And now finally E. If we look at E, we'll see that we do have the greater after a comma, but the thing is we have this intervening prepositional phrase, in skills underlying reading ability and non-verbal logic, the greater intellectual advantage is theirs. And so the more children use blah 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 in skills underlying reading ability and non-verbal logic, the greater. So this intervening clause, this intervening prepositional phrase shouldn't be here. We want to have the structure we talked about earlier. So it's the something, comma, the something. And so we want to have these two comparative adjectives closely following one another. So the more something something, comma, the something something. So this structure isn't going to work because of that intervening prepositional phrase, and it's also not really very GMAT style language to say the greater intellectual advantage is theirs. It's not really correct English or in any way what you'd expect to see in the GMAT. We want to have their intellectual advantage is greater because it actually is clear. It would be very much clear what we're talking about. So E is out for those two reasons. C is going to be our answer. So it's all about really spotting, in this case, the first comparative adjective, the more, in order to understand that we need to follow it up with another comparative adjective. So you're going to have, in all of these cases, you're going to have the article before it, so you can look out for that. So it's the comparative adjective, the something, so this other comparative adjective. And so to understand the structure and to spot it, I've seen it tested in about 2 or 3 official GMAT questions, so it does come up. That's what you need to spot and look out for. Okay, so that's the more the greater.